The first photograph showed the brick facade of my house. The third photograph showed my dead wife's Bible. The phone vibrated against the wooden nightstand. That harsh, continuous buzzing sound cut through the quiet of the guest cottage. I reached for the device in the dark, my fingers brushing the freezing glass screen. The smell of pine needles and stale coffee lingered in the chilled air of the room. At 68 years old, my eyes take a moment to adjust to sudden bright lights. I squinted at the notification. It came from a property tracking app. Harrington House was officially listed for sale. The asking price was $2,800,000. The description noted a motivated family sale, listing my oldest son, Luke Harrington, as the authorized contact. I swiped to the third picture in the gallery. My chest tightened. The staging company had moved the furniture, but what caught my attention rested on the center of the mahogany library table. Miriam's family Bible. The heavy leather cover looked worn, and a faded blue ribbon marked a page in the middle. That book had lived inside a locked glass cabinet for the last 2 years. Luke had the emergency key to the house, and he must have unlocked the cabinet to use the Bible as a rustic prop for the listing photos. I zoomed in on the image. Along the edge of the open page, faint blue ink stained the paper, handwriting. Someone had written a message in the margin, but the resolution was too low to read the whole sentence on my phone screen. I lowered the phone. 6 hours earlier, I had sat in my own living room and lied to my son. I did not file fake bankruptcy papers, nor did I commit any kind of fraud. I simply poured Luke a cup of coffee and told him a story. Over the past month, 2 different board members of the Harrington Family Outreach Program and one of my oldest friends had approached me with the exact same cautious tone. They asked if Thomas Harrington was forgetting appointments. They asked if I was making poor financial decisions. Their phrasing was too similar to be a coincidence. Someone was planting seeds about my mental decline, and all those whispers traced back to Luke. I needed to know if my son was just overly worried about his aging father, or if he was building a narrative to take control of my life. I told Luke that a bad investment and a looming legal dispute had tied up my assets. I claimed I was facing a severe liquidity crisis and asked if I could stay at his place for a few weeks while I figured out which properties to liquidate. Luke did not look shocked. He did not offer comfort. Instead, my oldest son just stared at his coffee cup, let out a slow breath, and smiled. Finally, that single word slipped out of his mouth before he could stop it. A second later, the mask slid back into place. Luke adopted a tone of deep concern, telling me that it was perfectly fine to admit I could no longer handle my responsibilities. But I had already seen the truth. That tiny, triumphant smile told me everything. He had been waiting for me to break. My own flesh and blood had been waiting for an excuse. I told Luke I was going to spend the weekend at a friend's vacant guest cottage to clear my head. I wanted him to think the house was empty. My personal lawyer already knew the truth about my finances, so my legal standing remained completely clean. I only expected to monitor his behavior over the next few days. I never expected him to move in the middle of the night. At exactly 1:43 in the morning, my security app had registered a breach. That was what woke me up before the real estate listing went live. I opened the camera logs. The night vision footage showed the heavy oak doors of my library swinging open. Luke walked in with a professional photographer. The boy had used the emergency key I gave him years ago. He had authorization to handle insurance claims and emergency repairs while I traveled. He absolutely did not have the legal authority to sell my property. I watched the silent footage. The photographer moved around the room, adjusting lamps and shifting chairs. Luke stood near the window. He held his phone flat against his ear, talking to someone on the other end. The library was practically soundproof, and the quiet atmosphere of the empty house amplified his voice just enough for the security camera microphone to pick up his words. "No, Hannah," Luke said. My breath caught in my throat. I sat up straight in the bed, pressing the phone closer to my ear. "The reconciliation fund is half," Luke continued, his voice echoing slightly in the dark room. "The mutual agreement comes first." Hearing that name felt like a physical blow. Hannah, my daughter, the child I had erased from my life 5 years ago. Back then, $340,000 had vanished from the Outreach Scholarship Fund. It was the darkest period of my career. Luke had brought me the login logs, the security timestamps, and the email chains. The evidence all pointed to Hannah. I chose to protect the charity. I stood in front of our community, read a statement condemning my own daughter, and forced her out of the organization. She begged me to look deeper, but I trusted the calm presentation of my son over her frantic pleas. I had not spoken to her since that night. Now, halfway through the night, Luke was talking to her. He was offering her a reconciliation fund. He was talking about giving her half. Half of what? The proceeds from my house? Was Hannah helping him steal my property out of revenge? Or was my son trying to pull her into a transaction I did not understand? My first instinct was to call the police, to drive back to Cedar Grove and throw Luke out of my house. I wanted to scream at him for violating my trust and invading my home. I dialed my lawyer instead. The attorney answered on the second ring. I explained the listing and the camera footage. He told me to breathe. He explained that a real estate listing did not equal a completed sale. Luke could put the house on the internet, but he could not force a closing without my physical signature or a completely fraudulent power of attorney. My lawyer advised me to let the listing sit for now. We would quietly contact the title company in the morning and place a strict hold on the deed. If we stopped the process right away, Luke would just claim it was a misunderstanding. We needed to let him build his own trap, securing the audit trail of his actions before he knew we were watching. I agreed. I hung up the phone and sat in the dark. Strangers were looking at photos of my bedroom on the internet. They were judging the value of the walls where I raised my family. It was a humiliating, helpless feeling. I opened the listing app again. I needed a distraction from the anger burning in my chest. I navigated back to the third picture. The staging company had made the library look bright and inviting, completely detached from the betrayal happening within its walls. I stared at the open Bible. Miriam had cherished that book. During her final months, 2 years ago, she had begged me to bring it to the hospital. I had forgotten, or maybe Luke had offered to bring it and never did. My memory of those painful weeks remained blurry, clouded by grief. I downloaded the high-resolution version of the photo to my phone. I pinched the screen, zooming in on the margins of the open page. The pixels sharpened. The blue ink became clear. I recognized the elegant, slanted loops of Miriam's handwriting immediately. My heart pounded against my ribs. I remembered the last time she tried to talk to me about our daughter. She had grabbed my hand, her grip weak but desperate, and tried to tell me something about the foundation accounts. Luke had gently pulled her hand away, telling me that her medication was causing delusions. I had listened to him. I had patted her hand and told her to rest. I zoomed in as far as the screen would allow. The blue words leaped off the digital page, crossing the centuries-old text of the scripture. Hannah did not steal the money. Luke did. The morning sun burned through the Georgia humidity as I parked my sedan at the end of the driveway. The real estate broker had not planted the coming soon sign on the lawn yet, likely to avoid alerting the neighbors prematurely, but the invasion was already visible inside. The heavy oak front door unlocked with a metallic click. Harrington House smelled entirely wrong. The familiar scent of Miriam's lavender polish had been aggressively scrubbed away, replaced by the sterile, chemical odor of industrial air freshener. A professional staging crew had clearly worked through the early hours of the morning. They had shifted the antique console table, removed the family portraits from the foyer, and erased 50 years of our history to create a blank canvas for buyers. The house had been in our family for 4 generations, and standing there in the empty hallway, surrounded by walls that had witnessed my entire marriage, I realized how easily a legacy could be dismantled. I walked slowly toward the library, and my shoes echoed against the hardwood floor. The glass display cabinet stood unlocked. The wooden shelf inside was completely empty. "Dad," a smooth voice called out from the hallway. Luke leaned against the doorframe, casually holding 2 paper coffee cups from the expensive cafe downtown. My oldest son wore a crisp navy blue suit, the exact shade and cut I used to wear to board meetings during my prime. He looked immaculate, composed, and completely at ease in the house he was actively trying to steal. "I thought you were staying at the cottage for the weekend," my son said, his tone perfectly calibrated to express mild surprise and gentle concern. I stepped away from the empty cabinet and accepted the warm cup he offered. The heat of the cardboard burned against my palms, anchoring my temper and keeping me grounded in reality. I needed to pick up a change of clothes. "I was just creating some options for us," Luke offered smoothly, gesturing with his free hand toward the rearranged leather armchairs. You admitted you were liquidating assets due to your liquidity crisis. I want to handle the heavy lifting of preparing the property so you do not have to stress yourself out. Creating options. That was his corporate phrase for seizing control. The young man set his coffee down, popped the brass latches on his leather briefcase, and pulled out a thick manila folder. He slid it across the mahogany table. Actually, since you are here, I have a few documents that need your signature. Just routine items to help me manage the immediate crisis on your behalf. I leafed through the crisp white pages, which smelled like fresh printer ink. Tucked neatly between generic insurance waivers and property tax forms was a broad power of attorney agreement. The legal language was dense, filled with complex clauses that granted him full, irrevocable authority over my banking accounts, investment portfolios, and all real estate holdings. My jaw tightened. I forced my facial muscles to remain slack and patted my jacket pockets, performing the tired sigh of an old man. I left my reading glasses on the nightstand at the cottage, so we can look at this heavy paperwork later. Luke reached out. Those manicured fingers tapped the edge of the folder. The warm, caring smile remained fixed on his face, but the temperature in the room seemed to plummet instantly. His eyes turned completely flat, resembling pieces of polished river stone. Of course, the boy I raised said quietly, "No rush at all. We just need to make sure you are legally protected when things get confusing." That specific word, confusing, triggered a sickening drop in my stomach. I looked away from his flat stare and noticed a small wooden podium tucked into the shadowy corner of the library. We had used that exact piece of furniture at the community center 5 years ago. The memory rose up, tasting like ash and stale water. $340,000 had gone missing from the Outreach Scholarship Fund. The charity board held an emergency session in the humid community hall, and the entire room smelled of melting floor wax and nervous sweat. Luke had stood at that wooden podium, projecting an aura of absolute, devastating sorrow. The executive director presented the server login records to the board members. He pointed to the security camera timestamps, and then he laid out the printed email chains. Every single piece of paper painted my daughter as a sophisticated thief. Hannah stood by the back wall, wearing a simple gray sweater. Her hands shook so violently she had to grip the plastic back of a folding chair to stay upright. She pleaded with me to look at the administrator rights. The accused woman begged the auditors to check exactly when her password had been reset. I refused to listen to her. Luke spoke with such measured, reasonable authority, explaining the tragedy of her betrayal. Hannah sounded frantic and hysterical. In my flawed logic, innocent people did not panic, and my golden boy would never lie. Naomi, my daughter-in-law, stepped forward and handed me a printed statement. I walked up to the microphone, cleared my throat, and read the words aloud, officially demanding my own daughter step down and leave the family home. Hannah did not scream. She just let go of the plastic chair, walked down the center aisle, and stopped right in front of me. "You are not choosing the truth," my daughter told me, her voice breaking the heavy silence of the hall. "You are choosing the child who makes you look good." I watched her walk out the double doors into the pouring rain. I let her disappear into the night, without a coat, without a job, and without a family. I chose the foundation over my own flesh and blood. A heavy wave of guilt washed over me, pulling my mind back to the present. I excused myself from the library, citing a sudden headache, and retreated to my private home office. I locked the heavy wooden door behind me, and my personal lawyer called exactly at 10 o'clock. "We pulled the digital audit trail on the real estate listing," the attorney said, his voice clipped and strictly professional over the speakerphone. "The draft description for the property was created 3 weeks ago." 3 weeks. I had told Luke about my fake bankruptcy only yesterday evening. "The interior photos were uploaded to the portal during your charity conference in Atlanta last month," the lawyer continued, the typing of his keyboard echoing over the line. "The account belongs to your son's executive assistant. They attached your old power of attorney to the file, the document that only covers basic insurance claims and emergency roof repairs." The attorney was not finished. His legal team had also dug into the metadata of the organization's recent server activity. During that same week last month, my son had downloaded and archived several board meeting minutes. Every single file contained highlighted clauses regarding continuity planning, in the event the founder became mentally impaired. The trap had been meticulously constructed long before my little test. The whispers among my friends and colleagues about my memory loss were not an accident. Luke had been actively running a campaign to establish a narrative of my mental decline. He did not need my fake bankruptcy to justify stealing the house. He only used my confession as a convenient, accelerated trigger to launch a hostile takeover under the noble guise of elder care. I ended the call and stepped out of the office. Luke had already left for the outreach headquarters, leaving the vast house silent once again. I needed to find Miriam's Bible. The staging crew had stacked several unmarked cardboard boxes in the hallway near the dining room. I opened the first box, finding nothing but old crystal vases. The second box held framed family photos, wrapped tightly in bubble wrap. Finally, at the bottom of the third box, hidden beneath a pile of decorative throw pillows, I found the worn leather cover. Luke had simply opened the book for the aesthetic value of the photograph, snapped the picture, and carelessly tossed the holy text into a packing box. He never bothered to read the handwritten note in the margins. I picked up the heavy volume. As my fingers wrapped firmly around the binding, I felt something strange. The spine of the book bulged outward slightly, as if something rigid and unnatural had been wedged tightly between the leather backing and the binding glue. I desperately wanted to tear the spine open right there on the floor. But Hannah's name had been on that security tape last night. If I tampered with physical evidence before understanding the entire picture, I might destroy the very thing I needed to save her. I slipped the book into my briefcase, snapping the brass lock shut with a sharp click. The rest of the day crawled by in a suffocating fog of paranoia. I drove back to the rural guest cottage as the Georgia sun began to set, watching the long shadows stretch across the empty dirt road. I sat on the wooden porch, nursing a glass of warm tap water, listening to the cicadas hum in the trees while waiting for my phone to ring. At 8:15, the screen illuminated the dark porch. The caller ID simply displayed an unknown number. I pressed the green answer button and brought the cold device to my ear. "Hello," I said, my voice rough from disuse. "Stop looking for the Bible in your house." The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and entirely devoid of warmth. I had not heard that exact cadence in 5 years, but my lungs tightened instantly. "Hannah," I breathed. The woman on the phone did not say hello. She did not call me Dad. "Luke checks the security cameras remotely," my daughter continued, her tone strictly instructional, speaking to me like a liability rather than a parent. "If he sees you digging through the staging boxes, he will know you are onto him." I gripped the wooden armrest of my patio chair. "I already found it. Are you helping your brother sell my house?" A long, heavy silence stretched over the cellular connection. I could hear the faint sound of city traffic passing in the background on her end. "You still asked the wrong question first," Hannah replied. The profound disappointment in her voice felt infinitely heavier than pure anger. "Luke told you on the phone last night that you were getting half the reconciliation fund," I pressed, needing a direct answer, terrified that my entire family had turned into monsters. "What did he mean by that?" "I am not having this conversation over an unsecured line," she said sharply, cutting off my panic. "Meet me tomorrow, in a public place. Not your house, not the charity office, and absolutely nowhere near my brother." "Okay," I agreed instantly, desperate to keep her from hanging up. "I will meet you wherever you want. I will text you the address in the morning," Hannah said. "Wait," I called out quickly before she could sever the connection. Miriam left a message in the margin of her book. "About you." The line went perfectly quiet again. When my daughter finally spoke, the clinical armor in her voice cracked just a fraction, revealing a raw, ancient grief that I had caused. "Mom believed me before she died. The question is why you didn't." The call ended, leaving me completely alone in the dark, listening to the dead silence of the phone. The neon sign of the roadside diner buzzed steadily against the gray morning sky. I arrived 20 minutes early, choosing a secluded booth near the back by the restrooms. The cracked red vinyl seat squeaked under my weight, and the air smelled heavily of burnt coffee and frying bacon. I sat with both hands wrapped around a ceramic mug, watching the entrance. Hannah walked through the glass door, exactly at 9 o'clock. 5 years can alter a person completely. I expected the panicked, tearful girl I had banished from our family home. The woman walking toward me moved with calm, deliberate precision. My daughter wore a tailored charcoal blazer over a crisp white blouse. No nervous fidgeting. No defensive posture. Her hair was pulled back into a severe knot, and her expression gave away absolutely nothing. She did not walk to my secluded booth in the back. Instead, the 35-year-old woman slid into a small table near the front window, keeping a clear line of sight to the main exit. I had to pick up my coffee and move across the restaurant to join her. I sat down across from my flesh and blood. The silence between us felt thick enough to choke on. I opened my mouth, the words catching in my dry throat. I want to say, I am sorry, I began, my voice barely a rasp. Stop. Hannah raised one hand, palm facing me. Her eyes held no anger, just a flat, impenetrable boundary. Do not apologize. Not before you know what you are apologizing for. She reached into her leather tote bag and pulled out a manila folder, sliding it across the sticky laminate table. My brother contacted me 2 weeks ago, my daughter said. 2 weeks ago, long before I tested Luke with my fake bankruptcy story. I opened the folder. Inside sat a stack of printed emails originating from a secure, encrypted server. Luke had not written anything as foolish as a direct bribe for my house. He used the sterile, insulating language of corporate law. The subject line read, Family Reconciliation Fund. The first page detailed a proposal. Luke offered a substantial payout from a newly created trust, contingent upon a future liquidity event. In exchange, the recipient had to sign a comprehensive mutual agreement package. I read through the attached appendix. The legal demands were incredibly specific. First, Hannah had to sign a sworn affidavit, confirming that her father had explicitly expressed a desire for Luke to assume full management of the family assets due to declining health. Second, she had to sign a family stability statement, redefining the embezzlement from 5 years ago as a mere system dispute that had been privately settled. Third, the agreement required her physical attendance and a supportive speech at the upcoming Founders' Jubilee Gala. The final clause demanded the surrender of all legacy accounting copies and a strict non-disparagement agreement. He wants to buy your compliance, I whispered, my stomach turning as I flipped to the final page. Look at Schedule B, she instructed, taking a slow sip of her ice water. I turned the paper over. The section detailing the exact monetary compensation remained entirely blank. Luke never wrote down a dollar amount, Hannah explained, her voice remarkably steady. He tied the payout to a liquidity event. Based on the timing, the sudden push for continuity planning, and the conversation you caught on tape last night, that event is the sale of Harrington House. He expects to force a closing, take the cash, and use a portion of the proceeds to buy my permanent silence. My grip on the folder tightened until my knuckles ached. You responded to him. The email thread shows you asking for clarification on the clauses. I kept my replies neutral. The data analyst across from me stated. If I rejected him outright, he would find another way to bury me. I needed him to keep writing, to keep outlining the mechanism of his fraud. The old instinct, the same poisonous doubt that had destroyed our relationship half a decade ago, flared in my chest. Why didn't you bring this to me immediately? Why didn't you go to the police? Hannah set her glass down. The ice cubes clinked sharply in the quiet diner. She leaned forward, resting her forearms on the table. Go to the police with what? She asked quietly. A vague contract offering a reconciliation fund? Without proof of where the money is coming from, it just looks like a messy family settlement. And bring it to you? The last time I brought you evidence of my innocence, you stood in front of the entire community and ordered me to leave. I flinched. The memory of that night hit me like a physical strike to the jaw. Are you really willing to help him sell my property? I asked, needing to hear her deny it. Do you actually want half the value of my home? My daughter stared at me, her gaze stripping away every defense I had left. I wanted my name back, she said, her voice dropping to a low, fierce whisper. He was the one who put a price on it. That single sentence carried more weight than a physical blow. Hannah reached back into her tote bag and retrieved a sleek black smartphone. She placed the device face up on the table between us. Mom called me, she said softly. The diner around us seemed to fade away. Miriam? I asked, my heart skipping a beat. When? 6 months before she passed away, Hannah replied. The professional armor finally slipped, revealing a brief flash of sorrow. She found something. Mismatched transactions in the old charity logs. Mom realized my login credentials had been used remotely. My wife had known. Miriam had figured out the truth while undergoing chemotherapy. She called from the landline at the oncology ward. Hannah continued, staring at the black screen of the phone. She was terrified that Luke monitored the family cellular plan and the home network. We tried to arrange a safe place to meet in person, but she died before we could make it happen. A cold sweat broke out along the back of my neck. I remembered the final weeks of Miriam's life. I remembered her frantic, desperate attempts to speak to me, and how Luke had constantly stood by her bed, managing her medications, and managing what I was allowed to hear. Hannah tapped the screen of the phone. An audio file appeared. She left one voicemail. My daughter said, pressing play. The speaker on the phone crackled. The sound of harsh, labored breathing filled the space between us. Then, my dead wife's voice drifted up from the digital recording. Hannah, it is Mom. Tears blurred my vision instantly. I was wrong to stay silent. The recording continued, her voice weak and broken by coughing. Thomas will not hear me yet. Luke is always in the room. But the book remembers what people erase. You have to look inside the spine. The audio ended with a sharp click. I sat frozen in the diner booth. The book remembers. Look inside the spine. I remembered Miriam, weakly pointing toward the library, on her final day at the house. She had begged me to bring her family Bible to the hospital. I had been so overwhelmed by grief and panic that I forgot. The next morning, Luke told me he would handle packing her personal items. He never brought the book to her room. I had not just ignored my daughter, I had ignored my dying wife. I reached into my leather briefcase resting on the floor. My hands shook violently as I pulled out the heavy, worn Bible and placed it gently on the table next to the phone. Hannah stared at the leather cover. She reached out, running a single finger along the frayed edge of the binding. She pressed against the thick, swollen section of the spine. I will help you, Hannah said, her eyes rising to meet mine. I have a lawyer and an independent forensic auditor ready to look at whatever is hidden in there. But we work on my terms. I nodded, unable to speak, the guilt suffocating me. 3 conditions, the woman across from me demanded. First, you do not offer me money, and you do not threaten me with your will. Second, any decision regarding the public release of my name must be approved by me first. You do not get to use me as a prop again. Agreed, I croaked. Third, Hannah leaned closer, her expression hardening into steel. If the evidence inside this book is corrupted or insufficient, you do not force me back onto that community stage. I will not stand there and be publicly humiliated a second time. I accept your terms, I promised, pressing my palms flat against the table. We are going to expose him. We are going to fix this family. Hannah picked up her folder and her phone, slipping them back into her bag. She stood up from the table, looking down at me with an expression of profound pity. Do not misunderstand my presence here, my daughter said quietly. I am helping expose Luke. I am not helping you feel like a good father again. She turned and walked toward the glass exit doors, leaving me alone with my coffee and the weight of my own failures. I looked down at the old, worn Bible, resting on the table. I thought about the fake bankruptcy, the secret real estate listing, and the years of missing funds. I placed my hand over the bulging spine of the leather book. Whatever my wife had hidden inside, Luke was willing to sell my house and erase our legacy before I found it. The polished mahogany table in my attorney's conference room felt ice cold beneath my palms. Sunlight filtered through the heavy blinds, illuminating dust motes, dancing in the sterile, air-conditioned air. Hannah sat entirely still on the leather sofa near the window. She kept her eyes fixed on the center of the table, refusing to look at me. Between us sat Miriam's old family Bible. My lawyer stood next to a data preservation specialist we had hired that morning. The technician wore thin latex gloves. He held a small, sharp scalpel in his right hand. The blade hovered just above the worn leather spine of my dead wife's most cherished possession. Ready? The technician asked, looking at me for final approval. I gave a short nod, and the metal blade sliced into the aged binding. The dry glue cracked, making a sharp, tearing sound that echoed in the quiet room. He carefully peeled back the stiff leather. Tucked deep inside the hollow space of the spine, wrapped tightly in yellowed wax paper, was a tiny black memory card. The technician used tweezers to extract the small square. A folded piece of stationery came out with it. I recognized the thick cream paper from Miriam's personal desk set. The handwriting was rushed, the blue ink pressed hard into the fibers. The note contained 2 simple sentences, dated roughly 3 years before she died. Original export. Do not trust the revised books. My heart hammered against my ribs, heavy and uneven. I reached for the memory card, but the technician gently blocked my hand. Chain of custody, the specialist explained, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. If you plug this directly into a standard laptop, the operating system alters the metadata. Luke could claim we tampered with the files. I have to create a read-only copy, generate a hash code for verification, and seal the original in an evidence bag. The waiting felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. For 45 minutes, the only sound in the conference room was the quiet hum of the technician's specialized equipment and the rhythmic tapping of Hannah's shoe against the carpet. I watched the clock on the wall, each second dragging the tension tighter. Finally, the specialist unplugged his machine and handed a silver flash drive to the forensic auditor sitting at the far end of the table. The auditor plugged the drive into his secure monitor, and rows of dense financial data flooded the large screen. This is a raw export from the Harrington Family Outreach accounting server, the auditor said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. The data matches the time frame your wife noted, and it paints a very clear picture. He selected a series of transactions, highlighting them in bright yellow. Your son did not steal a massive lump sum, the accountant continued, tracing the lines with a silver pen. He siphoned the scholarship funds through hundreds of micro-transfers. The money flowed out of the primary charity accounts and directly into 3 linked non-profit organizations. Hannah leaned forward, her eyes scanning the screen. Check the registered addresses for those shell entities. The auditor clicked a different tab, pulling up state registration records. The third organization listed a corporate address in downtown Atlanta. My stomach turned instantly. I recognized that street name and suite number. Years ago, Luke had casually mentioned renting a small corporate apartment there to host out-of-town donors. He had used my charity's money to pay for his private luxury suite. The total missing funds on this original ledger add up to just over $600,000, the auditor confirmed, turning away from the screen. When we compare this to the current live database your organization uses today, these specific vendor payments have been entirely erased or renamed. The theft had not ended 5 years ago. My son had simply used Hannah as a convenient sacrifice to protect an ongoing, massive embezzlement operation. There is an audio file in the main folder, the data technician interrupted, clicking a small blue icon. It is brief, maybe 2 minutes long. The sound of static filled the conference room. A second later, Miriam's voice drifted through the high-end speakers. She sounded tired, her breath catching slightly as she spoke. Why did the consulting firm receive a payment without a signed contract? My wife asked on the recording. Hannah authorized that vendor, Luke replied. His recorded voice sounded perfectly calm, radiating that same terrifying reasonableness he always used in public. You know she manages the digital entry system, Mom. Hannah resigned 3 weeks ago. Miriam countered, her tone sharpening with suspicion. She is gone. A long pause stretched over the audio file. I could hear the faint sound of a pen tapping against a desk. Her login is still clean, Luke finally said. I can reset it tonight. The recording captured the sudden click of a doorknob turning, followed by the heavy thud of a door opening. The audio cut off abruptly. It was not a complete legal confession, but the words confirmed everything we needed to know. My son had the technical knowledge and the administrative power to manipulate the system. He had weaponized the servers against his own sister. I looked at Hannah. She did not look vindicated or relieved. Her eyes were fixed on a different document the auditor had opened on the secondary monitor. Look at the file properties on the draft statement, my daughter instructed, pointing at the screen. The auditor clicked the Properties tab for a text document labeled as a public relations release. It was the exact statement I had read aloud to the community 5 years ago, the one that formally accused Hannah of theft and demanded her resignation. The metadata shows the author, the accountant noted, his brow furrowing. The device used to type this original draft, belonged to Naomi Harrington, my daughter-in-law. I pictured Naomi's face, remembering how she had brought me coffee that terrible night, offering comforting words while handing me the paper that ruined Hannah's life. But Naomi had also spent countless hours sitting by Miriam's hospital bed during her final months. The contradiction felt impossible to reconcile. She wrote the statement before the money was even reported missing, Hannah said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Look at the creation date. Naomi drafted my public execution 3 days before Luke claimed he discovered the discrepancy. She knew everything. The revelation hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. My entire family structure was a carefully constructed lie. Naomi was not just a supportive wife standing by her husband. She was an active architect of the fraud. Before I could process the depth of Naomi's involvement, my cell phone vibrated violently against the mahogany table. 2 seconds later, Hannah's phone lit up. Then the lawyer's device buzzed. I unlocked my screen. Several text messages from confused charity board members flooded my notifications, all containing links to the official Harrington Family Outreach social media page. Turn on the monitor, I told the auditor, my throat suddenly dry. He switched the display to the internet browser and opened the link. Luke was broadcasting a live video directly from the executive office of the charity headquarters. My son sat behind the massive oak desk, wearing a dark suit, his hands folded neatly in front of him. He looked directly into the camera lens with an expression of profound, unbearable grief. The performance was flawless. I am speaking to you today with a very heavy heart, Luke began, his voice thick with calculated emotion. Many of you know that my family has endured significant tragedies over the past few years. We lost my mother, and we suffered through a very public betrayal by my estranged sister. He paused, taking a slow, shaky breath. Recently, my father has begun showing severe signs of financial instability and cognitive distress, the young man continued, staring into the lens with manufactured sorrow. He is grieving, and unfortunately, he is being manipulated by those who wish to harm this foundation. To protect the children who rely on our scholarships, I am calling an emergency meeting of the board of directors. My phone started ringing. The caller ID showed the name of our largest corporate donor. I ignored it, watching the screen, as my son systematically dismantled my reputation in real time. Luke leaned closer to the camera, his eyes conveying a desperate plea for understanding. He was not directly calling Hannah a thief again, carefully avoiding the risk of a defamation lawsuit, but he was successfully painting us both as active threats to poor children. We must prioritize the legacy of this organization over personal family matters, the executive director said softly, closing his eyes for a brief moment. Until my father receives a proper evaluation, the board must assume he is no longer capable of protecting this family's legacy. The live stream ended, leaving the attorney's conference room in a suffocating, heavy silence. Luke had just declared me mentally incompetent to our entire donor base. The forensic auditor sitting across the mahogany table adjusted his glasses and explained a bitter reality. Internal server logs could be altered by anyone holding administrative privileges. Since Luke controlled the network, any data we extracted directly from those machines would be instantly dismissed as tampered evidence. We needed an independent, untouchable source. Hannah leaned back against the leather sofa, crossing her arms over her charcoal blazer. She did not look defeated. Check the external door logs, my daughter said quietly, staring at the blank monitor. The building insurance policy required a third-party security firm to manage the physical access cards. Luke cannot edit their off-site servers. The air rushed out of my lungs. 5 years ago, standing in a humid community hall filled with angry board members, Hannah had screamed those exact words at me. I had ignored her, choosing to trust my son's neatly printed spreadsheets instead. My lawyer immediately opened his laptop and began typing an urgent preservation request to the security vendor. The encrypted file arrived 48 hours later. We gathered around the monitor, watching the auditor open the access logs. This raw data contained no corporate spin or convenient excuses. It offered nothing but cold, irrefutable timestamps. Here is your daughter's keycard activity for the night. The money initially disappeared, the auditor stated, dragging his cursor across a highlighted row. The bright screen displayed the exit time, 8:12 in the evening. Hannah had swiped out of the building. The fraudulent financial transaction that drained the scholarship fund occurred at exactly 9 o'clock. The side entrance operates on a strict one-way locking mechanism, my lawyer added, reading the security hardware specifications. You can exit the premises, but you cannot re-enter the building without a recorded swipe. Your daughter left the property 48 minutes before the theft happened. The auditor scrolled down to the next entry in the digital ledger. At 8:30, a different keycard had accessed the restricted executive wing. Luke Harrington. My son had entered the administration area while Hannah was driving home. This was the first piece of objective, undeniable proof that shattered the narrative I had blindly believed for half a decade. The third-party vendor also provided the automated cloud backups for the administration portal. The accountant cross-referenced the entry timestamps and pulled up the security protocol history. The perpetrator did not simply guess Hannah's credentials, the auditor explained, bringing up a new window filled with complex code. Someone forcibly reset her password at 8:45. The override command originated from the primary executive administration account, Luke's personal account. The system required a two-factor authentication code. The recovery digits were sent directly to the private cellular device registered to my son's office. Furthermore, the IP address attached to the fraudulent transfer belonged to a desktop computer located in the executive suite, nowhere near the cubicle where my daughter used to work. The room went perfectly still. We finally possessed the digital footprint of the frame-up. The evidence was absolute. Hannah stared at the glowing monitor for a long time. She did not smile, and she did not celebrate the victory. She slowly turned her head and looked directly into my eyes. "Was this enough for you 5 years ago?" my daughter asked. Her voice held no malice, only a profound, exhausting sadness. I opened my mouth, but my throat felt filled with sand. I had no excuse to offer. I just looked down at my hands, wishing the floor would open up and swallow me. Armed with the certified logs, I demanded an emergency closed session with the board of directors. The meeting took place in the sterile conference room at the charity headquarters. Luke sat at the head of the long table, wearing a perfectly tailored gray suit, looking entirely unbothered by my sudden arrival. I laid the third-party security reports in front of the executive committee. I showed them the door timestamps, the password reset history, and the IP addresses. I expected outrage. I expected them to suspend my son immediately. Instead, the board members shifted uncomfortably in their expensive chairs, refusing to make eye contact with me. Luke did not raise his voice or show any panic. He gently closed the evidence folder and offered a patronizing, sympathetic smile. "These old files lack vital context," the young man told the room, using his calmest, most reassuring tone. "Hannah often asked me to reset her passwords when she forgot them. As for the door logs, she could have easily propped the exit open with a wooden wedge. It was a flimsy, pathetic lie, but the board grasped it like a lifeline. A major scandal would jeopardize their upcoming fundraising gala. Several members expressed concern over the organization's public image, arguing that revisiting a 5-year-old closed case would only hurt the children relying on our scholarships. They voted to delay any independent technical review and formally requested that I cease all public statements regarding the matter. Sitting there in the stifling room, I looked at the faces of my colleagues. They were actively choosing a comfortable lie over a devastating truth to protect their own reputations. In their cowardly silence, I saw the exact reflection of my own failure from 5 years ago. I returned to the attorney's office that afternoon. The forensic auditor had not wasted the day. The certified bank records had finally cleared the verification process, and the full, horrifying scope of my son's greed illuminated the dual monitors. "The theft did not stop when Hannah left," the accountant said grimly, leaning back in his chair. He traced a complex web of wire transfers across the screen. "For 4 consecutive years after my daughter was banished, money continued to bleed from the scholarship reserve. The funds funneled into linked shell nonprofits, eventually washing into a consulting firm controlled by his associates. The total verified loss is $1,460,000, the auditor confirmed, tapping his silver pen against the desk. My breath caught in my throat. The initial sum of $340,000 had merely been a test run. Luke had sacrificed his own sister to secure a pipeline of untraceable wealth, and he had been draining the charity ever since. "Why is he trying to sell your house right now?" the lawyer asked, looking over the dense banking summaries. If he has been stealing steadily for years, what triggered the sudden real estate listing? Hannah pulled a printed newsletter from her leather tote bag and slid it across the table. It was a formal announcement from our largest corporate donor. They were demanding a comprehensive, independent financial audit of the charity before renewing their annual grant. The inspection was scheduled to begin in less than 4 weeks. He has a massive hole in the ledger, my daughter explained, tracing the corporate logo with one finger. Luke planned to use the forged power of attorney and fraudulent seller wire instructions to divert the net proceeds into a family continuity account he controlled. From there, he could route the money through his shell organizations as emergency donations and fill the missing balance before the independent auditors arrived. Gregory's company would buy the house below market value, resell it later, and divide the profit with him. The house sale is not just greed. It is a desperate rescue operation. My son was backed into a corner, racing against a ticking clock. But instead of panicking, Luke simply accelerated his manipulation. My phone buzzed against the table with an incoming email notification. The subject line announced the official schedule for the upcoming Founders Jubilee, a highly publicized charity event set to take place in exactly 3 weeks. I opened the attached press release, and my blood ran completely cold. The document detailed a special family reconciliation ceremony. According to the carefully crafted text, I would formally announce my retirement due to health concerns, passing the torch entirely to Luke. The program also included a segment where Hannah would return to the stage to publicly address the mistakes of the past. Neither of us had agreed to any of this. Luke was using the organization's massive public relations machine to manufacture a reality, trapping us in a narrative before we could expose his crimes. If we refused to attend, we proved his public claim that we were unstable. Hannah picked up the printed press release. Her eyes scanned the schedule, lingering on the location of the upcoming gala. It was the exact same community hall where she had been destroyed 5 years ago. She dropped the paper onto the mahogany table. "He is not inviting me back," my daughter said, her voice dropping to a freezing, absolute whisper. "He is bringing me back to the same stage so he can convict me twice." My lawyer sent 2 separate notices. The first went to the title company, which flagged the deed and refused to insure or close any transfer without my verified authorization. The second went to the listing broker and the multiple listing service compliance office, attaching my ownership records and disputing Luke's authority to act for me. Within hours, the online listing was suspended while the platform preserved its complete audit trail. The house had never legally left my name, but for the first time since the notification arrived, the immediate sale threat was contained. The message carried a direct, legally binding notice to the regional title company. Thomas Harrington had not authorized the sale of his property. The response arrived 20 minutes later. The title officers placed a hard freeze on the deed, effectively locking the transaction in administrative concrete. I watched the property listing website refresh on the monitor. The bright green active banner shifted to a dull gray inactive status, yet the platform preserved the entire digital audit trail of my son's actions. A heavy, genuine sense of relief washed over my shoulders. I finally had my house back. My phone vibrated against the mahogany table. The screen displayed Luke's name. I answered the call, keeping my breathing slow and measured. "Dad," the executive director said, his voice dripping with manufactured shock. "The real estate broker just called me in an absolute panic. He completely misunderstood our continuity planning discussions and pushed the listing live by mistake. I am so incredibly sorry for the confusion." The lie was smooth, polished, and delivered without a single tremor. I did not mention the shell company buyer or the metadata proving the listing was prepared weeks ago. I simply thanked him for clarifying the situation and ended the call. By Tuesday morning, the pressure began to fracture the foundation's united front. A major corporate sponsor caught wind of the title freeze and demanded a formal explanation. Terrified of losing their annual funding, the executive board convened an emergency session and authorized an immediate internal review of the financial discrepancies. I sat in my quiet guest cottage, reading the official notification email. A small spark of hope flared in my chest. The system was finally forcing accountability. I called Hannah to share the news. My daughter did not celebrate. Who did they hire to conduct the review? the woman on the phone asked, the line crackling slightly. A firm from Atlanta, I replied, reading the corporate letterhead. They are a reputable auditing group. Hannah sighed, and the sound carried 5 years of pure exhaustion. That specific firm held a consulting contract with Luke 3 years ago. They helped him restructure the executive compensation packages. I argued that certified professionals would prioritize their operating licenses over a personal favor. I still desperately wanted to believe that the established corporate protocols would naturally correct the injustice. That evening, I drove back to the empty Harrington house to collect the rest of my mail. I found my son standing in the grand foyer. The confident executive mask had vanished completely. Luke wore a wrinkled button-down shirt, his shoulders slumped, and his eyes were red and swollen. He walked toward me, his hands shaking. I panicked, Dad. When you told me about the bankruptcy, I felt the entire family legacy slipping away. Tears spilled over his lower eyelashes, tracking down his pale cheeks. The boy I raised wept openly in the hallway, looking small and incredibly vulnerable. He begged me to understand the immense pressure he carried on his shoulders every single day. Then, the narrative smoothly shifted. Luke wiped his face and looked at the floor. Naomi pushed for the immediate listing, he whispered, his voice trembling with artificial regret. My wife is completely obsessed with our public image. She convinced me that we had to secure the capital before the bank seized the property. Please do not destroy the charity, because we made one bad decision in a moment of fear. A sharp ache blossomed in my chest. I almost reached out to comfort him. The paternal instinct to protect my grieving child fought against the cold, hard evidence sitting in my lawyer's safe. Luke noticed my hesitation. He took a step closer, wiping the last tear from his chin. Hannah always knew how to make you feel guilty. Do not let her use this misunderstanding to tear us apart. The illusion shattered instantly. His tone held the exact same arrogant contempt he had wielded 5 years ago. My son was not apologizing for stealing. He was simply trying to manage his primary investor. The text message arrived the following afternoon. Naomi asked me to meet her at the parking garage of the oncology center where Miriam had received her treatments. I parked my sedan on the concrete roof, stepping out into the suffocating, humid afternoon air. The smell of hot asphalt and car exhaust mixed with the faint, sterile medicinal odor venting from the hospital building below. The glaring sunlight reflected off the rows of parked cars, making my eyes ache. My daughter-in-law stood beside her luxury SUV, clutching a manila envelope against her chest. She looked terrified, constantly checking her mirrors for approaching vehicles. I wrote the initial public statement. Naomi blurted out before I even reached her vehicle. Luke handed me a folder full of printed security logs and told me Hannah was destroying the foundation. He said if the scandal leaked to the press, the scholarship fund would collapse immediately. I stopped walking. You knew the timeline in that statement was a lie. Naomi avoided my gaze, staring down at the painted concrete lines. The former communications director admitted to helping Luke keep Hannah occupied in the main office, so the security cameras would capture her presence. She confessed to deleting appointments from the public calendar to manipulate the timeline. The woman standing in front of me had traded 5 years of silence for a luxury lifestyle, exclusive vacations, and the image of a perfect marriage. She handed me a single piece of paper from her envelope. It was a printed copy of an old email, proving she had drafted the statement early. However, she kept her phone locked tightly in her purse. I will give your lawyers everything, Naomi promised, her voice rising in panic. But I need a written guarantee of immunity. I cannot go to prison for his mistakes. I looked at the woman who had helped write the social death warrant for my daughter. I refused to offer false comfort. I told her that my attorney would note her voluntary cooperation, but I could not trade justice for a confession. She had to bear the weight of her own choices. Naomi nodded slowly, her shoulders dropping in defeat, and agreed to surrender her devices to the legal team tomorrow. The internal audit report landed in my inbox 2 days later. The document was a masterpiece of corporate misdirection, bound in glossy digital formatting. The consulting firm hired by the board concluded that no intentional fraud had occurred within the organization. They categorized the missing hundreds of thousands of dollars as administrative misclassifications and outdated bookkeeping. The auditors claimed that the legacy data retrieved from Miriam's records was fragmented, out of context, and inherently unreliable. Furthermore, the concluding paragraph contained a thinly veiled accusation implying that unauthorized personnel had illegally accessed confidential files in an attempt to harass the current executive team. 10 minutes later, Luke issued a mass communication to the entire donor network. The executive director formally thanked the board for their diligent oversight and requested privacy for our family healing process. The system had worked exactly as it was designed to work. It provided the answers the person in power needed to hear. I drove straight to the attorney's office. Hannah was already there, pacing the length of the conference room. The independent forensic auditor sat at the mahogany table, organizing a stack of newly acquired corporate registry documents. He had spent the last 3 days tracing the anonymous buyer who had attempted to purchase Harrington House. The purchasing entity is a limited liability corporation, the auditor explained, sliding a heavy paper across the polished wood. The registered agent is a man named Gregory Vance. I recognized the name immediately. Gregory Vance was Luke's former college roommate. The accountant pulled up a secondary spreadsheet, highlighting a column of vendor payments. This same corporate entity received monthly consulting fees from the exact shell nonprofit listed in your late wife's hidden ledger. The entire grand design finally snapped into terrifying focus. Luke never intended to sell my home to a stranger. He planned to sell the property significantly below market value to his college friend. They would take the massive cash injection and funnel it right back into the foundation under the guise of an anonymous emergency donation. That money would fill the gaping hole in the charity accounts just in time to pass the upcoming independent corporate audit. Later, the two men would resell the house at full market value and split the untraceable profit off the books. My son was not merely robbing his father. The brilliant executive was using the walls that sheltered our family to launder his stolen wealth and silence his sister simultaneously. The room fell quiet as the magnitude of the betrayal settled over us. Hannah stopped pacing. The young woman walked over to the table and stared down at the name of her brother's college friend. We possessed the connection, but we still needed the final piece of leverage to force the truth into the light. For the next 17 days, Naomi sent nothing else. Our lawyers kept the title hold in place, while the forensic team preserved records, traced the buyer, and documented the widening financial scheme. The founder's jubilee drew closer with every unanswered call. 48 hours before the gala, my phone chimed. A secure message from Naomi displayed a photograph of a printed document lying on her kitchen counter. The stark black heading read, "Contingency Plan, Naomi Harrington Sole Liability." Beneath the photograph, she had written one sentence: "He is going to make me the next Hannah." Less than an hour later, the heavy glass door of the attorney's conference room swung open. Naomi Harrington entered beside her personal defense lawyer, carrying a silver laptop and a cracked smartphone. Her usually flawless hair was pulled into a disordered knot, and rain darkened the shoulders of her designer trench coat. She no longer resembled the confident communications director who had engineered our family's public image. She looked like a woman who had finally discovered the trapdoor beneath her own feet. Naomi unclasped her leather handbag and placed a silver laptop and a cracked smartphone onto the mahogany table. The devices slid across the polished wood, stopping inches from the independent data specialist. "My client is surrendering these items voluntarily," her attorney stated, his voice carrying that clinical precision inherent to his profession. "We understand that you cannot promise formal immunity from prosecution. We only ask that her active cooperation is permanently documented in your records." My lawyer nodded, sliding a release form across the table. "Everything is noted. We will maintain a strict chain of custody." Hannah sat on the leather sofa near the window, watching the exchange with cold, unblinking eyes. The young woman who had lost 5 years of her life did not offer a single word of comfort. She just stared at Naomi, the exact same way a judge stares at a convicted criminal. The forensic technician donned his latex gloves, connecting the old smartphone to his secure extraction terminal. While the progress bar crawled across his monitor, Naomi sank into an empty chair and buried her face in her hands. I knew the timeline was wrong, the former communications director whispered, the words spilling out of her in a rush. When Luke told me the scholarship money was missing 5 years ago, he brought me a stack of printed server logs. He said Hannah was destroying the foundation. He told me to keep her occupied in the main office so the security cameras would record her staying late. My chest tightened. I remembered Hannah standing in that humid community hall, begging me to check the door logs, while Naomi handed me the official termination statement. "You deleted my afternoon appointment from the public calendar," Hannah said softly from the sofa, her voice completely devoid of warmth. "You trapped me in the building so he could build his narrative." Naomi flinched, as if physically struck. She lowered her hands, revealing red, tear-streaked cheeks. "I believed him at first. I swear I did. He was my husband, and he had all those spreadsheets. But later, I started noticing the contradictions. The vendor names did not make sense. The cash flows were too complicated. I saw the truth, and I chose to stay quiet. Because the truth did not buy luxury apartments in Atlanta," Hannah countered, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "Silence paid for your vacations. Silence paid for your perfect family portraits." Naomi did not argue. The woman simply bowed her head, accepting the brutal reality of her complicity. She had traded an innocent life for comfort, and now that same corrupt system was turning its sights on her. A sharp beep from the technician's terminal interrupted the heavy tension. The data extraction was complete. The forensic auditor leaned over the monitor, opening a specific hidden folder Naomi had flagged on the device. "Here is the file she sent you a picture of," the auditor announced, projecting the document onto the large wall screen. The bold black header read, "Contingency Plan, Naomi Harrington's sole liability." We read the text in absolute silence. The document was a masterclass in corporate manipulation. Luke had prepared a comprehensive emergency defense strategy in the event the upcoming independent financial audit uncovered the missing $1 million. The files detailed a scenario where Naomi had supposedly created the fake vendor accounts, forged his signature on the transfer authorizations, and manipulated the public relations department to cover her tracks. My son planned to take the stage as the devastated, betrayed husband. He had meticulously rewritten all the horrified, disappointed phrases he had once used against Hannah, repackaging them to destroy his own wife. "He recycled the script," Hannah observed, recognizing the familiar cadence of the accusations. "Luke does not have partners. He only has shields." Naomi stared at the screen, her breathing shallow and erratic. "I found that file hidden on his tablet last night. He is going to feed me to the auditors. He is going to let me go to prison so he can keep his foundation." The auditor clicked a different file icon, opening a document titled Founders Jubilee Rehearsal. "This is the run of show for the gala in 2 days, the accountant noted, scrolling through the heavily annotated pages. "It reads like a theatrical play." The script detailed every single minute of the upcoming charity event. According to the notes, I would step up to the podium and announce my immediate retirement due to failing health. Following my departure, Hannah would approach the microphone to apologize for the misunderstandings of the past, effectively validating his version of history. Then, the spotlight would shift to Naomi. The script explicitly required my daughter-in-law to cry on cue while taking full public responsibility for the current accounting irregularities. Finally, Luke would step forward as the sole savior of the Harrington legacy, promising to guide the foundation through the storm. "Look at the margin notes on page 4. My lawyer interrupted, pointing a pen at the screen. Tucked into the edge of the document was a timeline trigger. The moment the gala concluded and the public narrative was cemented, Luke planned to execute the closing documents on Harrington House. He was using the emotional spectacle of the family reconciliation to distract the board while he quietly laundered the stolen money through the real estate transaction. "He cannot force me to retire," I said, my voice thick with anger. "He cannot make me step down if I refuse to play along." Naomi looked at me, her eyes filled with a terrifying, hollow certainty. "Yes, he can. You do not understand how far ahead he planned this." She gestured for the auditor to open a folder labeled Medical Documentation. A series of short video clips filled the monitor. The first video showed me at the breakfast table, struggling to remember the name of a distant cousin. The second clip captured me losing my temper over a misplaced set of car keys. The third showed me looking exhausted and confused after a long flight. My son had secretly recorded my most vulnerable moments, stripping away all context, to create a highlight reel of severe cognitive decline. "There is a medical evaluation attached," the auditor said, his voice dropping in disbelief. The digital document contained a formal psychological assessment diagnosing me with advanced memory loss and an inability to manage my own finances. The signature at the bottom, belonged to a private consulting physician located in a different state, a doctor who had never once examined me in person. If you try to rebel at the gala, or if you try to block the house sale, Naomi explained, her hands trembling against her lap, Luke is going to file an emergency petition for control over your estate. He will submit those videos and that fake medical evaluation to a judge. He does not even need to win the case permanently. He just needs to create enough legal chaos to strip you of your authority while he signs the final closing documents on the house. The sheer scale of the manipulation left the room breathless. My son was prepared to medically erase my autonomy to protect his stolen wealth. My lawyer closed his laptop, his expression grave. We need to keep Naomi's defection completely quiet for now. If Luke realizes she handed over the devices, he might accelerate his timeline and file the competency petition immediately. Hannah stood up from the sofa, crossing her arms over her chest. Are you going to protect her? My daughter asked, looking directly at me. Are you going to let Naomi walk away clean just because she brought you the evidence? Are you going to choose the image of a respectable family again? 5 years ago, I had chosen the easy lie to preserve our reputation. I looked at the young woman whose life I had shattered, and then I looked at the daughter-in-law who had helped build the trap. No, I answered, my voice steady and resolute in the quiet room. Naomi will face the legal consequences for her role in the embezzlement. The prosecutors will see her full involvement. We are not discarding this evidence because it proves the truth, but we are not trading justice for convenience either. I turned to Naomi. You will not be the sole scapegoat, but you will pay for what you did to my daughter. Naomi did not protest. She picked up the legal release form, her hand shaking violently, and signed her name on the dotted line. She formally surrendered her electronic life to the investigators, accepting the ruin of her own carefully crafted image. The meeting concluded an hour later. The rain had stopped, leaving the city streets slick and dark. I stood by the conference room window, watching the traffic below, feeling the heavy burden of truth settling over my shoulders. We finally possessed the entire puzzle. We had the original ledger, the security logs, the shell company records, and the contingency plans. My cell phone rang, breaking the silence of the empty office. My lawyer's name illuminated the screen. Thomas, the attorney said, his professional composure completely fractured. He was breathing heavily, as if he had sprinted down a hallway. What happened? I asked, gripping the windowsill. The courthouse just notified my office, the lawyer replied, the words hitting me like a physical strike. Luke did not wait for the gala. He filed the emergency petition an hour ago. He officially declared you mentally incompetent and claimed Hannah is manipulating your assets. My chest seized. The trap had sprung. The judge granted an expedited review. The attorney continued, the panic clear in his voice. The first competency hearing is scheduled for tomorrow morning. The harsh morning fluorescent lights of the county courthouse stung my eyes. The hallway smelled of old floor wax, damp wool, and stale coffee from the vending machines down the corridor. My lawyer stood next to me, holding a thick leather briefcase filled with certified bank records, door logs, and the third-party security extractions. Hannah sat on a wooden bench near the courtroom doors, her posture rigid, her hands folded tightly over her handbag. She had not slept, her face pale beneath the harsh overhead bulbs, but her eyes burned with absolute, cold determination. We had 48 hours before the scheduled Founders Jubilee Gala, but Luke had successfully accelerated his timeline. He wanted to strip away my legal autonomy before I could ever reach that stage. The heavy oak doors swung open, and a court clerk called our case file. We filed into the small, sterile courtroom. Luke sat at the petitioner's table across the aisle, flanked by a high-priced corporate attorney from Atlanta. My son wore a somber navy blue suit, projecting an aura of profound, heartbreaking sorrow. He looked like a dutiful child, forced to take tragic action against a deteriorating parent. His legal team moved with aggressive confidence, sliding a stack of bound medical petitions toward the bench before the judge had even settled into his leather chair. The presiding judge, an aging man with tired eyes and graying hair, adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and scanned the top pages of the file. Mr. Harrington, the judge began, looking down at my son's attorney. You are seeking emergency conservatorship under an expedited timeline, citing severe cognitive decline and financial endangerment of a major public charity. Yes, Your Honor, Luke's attorney replied smoothly, standing up to address the court. The petitioner has exhausted every other option. Mr. Like, Thomas Harrington is suffering from advanced memory lapses, erratic decision-making, and profound vulnerability to outside manipulation by estranged parties. The lawyer gestured toward Hannah with a clean, dismissive sweep of his hand. We have submitted verified medical evaluations from a licensed specialist confirming his diminished capacity, the attorney continued, laying out the fake assessment we had uncovered the previous afternoon. Furthermore, we have documented instances where the elder Mr. Harrington failed to recognize long-standing business associates and demonstrated erratic financial choices that threatened the livelihood of the Scholarship Foundation. My lawyer rose immediately, buttoning his jacket with measured calm. Objection, Your Honor. The medical evaluation submitted by the petitioner was conducted by an out-of-state physician who has never met, examined, or spoken to my client. It is a fabricated document, designed to bypass standard due process. The judge frowned, flipping through the pages of the medical brief. Do you have counter-documentation ready for an expedited review? Counsel. We do, Your Honor, my lawyer answered, placing a certified independent evaluation on the wooden railing. My client voluntarily submitted to a comprehensive cognitive and neurological examination by a court-approved geriatric specialist yesterday afternoon. The findings confirm that Mr. Thomas Harrington is fully competent, oriented, and completely capable of managing his own estate and legal affairs. Luke leaned over and whispered something urgently into his attorney's ear. The corporate lawyer immediately shook his head slightly, maintaining his composed, professional posture. We request a brief recess to review these late submissions, Luke's counsel argued, stepping forward. Regardless of the cognitive baseline, Your Honor, the underlying crisis remains urgent. The Harrington Family Outreach Foundation is facing imminent financial exposure due to unauthorized interference with real estate titles and erratic asset management by the respondent. The judge stared at both legal teams, the lines around his mouth deepening with annoyance. This court will not grant an emergency conservatorship based on disputed medical claims and rushed petitions. However, given the massive financial stakes of the charity involved, I am ordering a temporary administrative stay on all major real estate transactions associated with Harrington House until a full evidentiary hearing can be conducted next month. An administrative stay. It was not a total victory, but it completely paralyzed Luke's plan to close the house sale before the upcoming independent audit. My son's face tightened for a fraction of a second. The carefully constructed mask of the grieving, worried child slipped, exposing the cold, calculating predator beneath. But the professional recovery was instantaneous. Luke bowed his head respectfully, accepting the judge's ruling with quiet grace, refusing to show his anger inside the courtroom. We exited the courthouse into the bright afternoon sunlight. The humid Georgia air clung to my skin like a wet blanket. Hannah walked beside me down the concrete steps, her jaw set. He failed to lock down the estate today, my daughter noted, her voice low as we reached the perimeter of the parking lot. Which means he is going to push twice as hard to execute the second half of his plan at the gala. The Jubilee is the day after tomorrow, I reminded her, checking the watch on my wrist. He still expects us to show up on that stage and play our assigned roles. We will be there, Hannah said quietly. And so will the truth. That evening, sitting alone in the quiet guest cottage, I reviewed the final strategy with my legal team. We had secured the original ledger from Miriam's Bible, the third-party door logs, the server reset timestamps, the shell company bank records linking Gregory Vance to the property purchase, and Naomi's complete digital surrender. The evidence stack was impenetrable. Yet, legally executing an arrest or public exposure required careful theatrical timing. If we went to the police before the gala, Luke would simply hide behind his corporate board, claim ignorance, and let lower-level associates take the fall. To break his control permanently, we had to dismantle his public mask on the exact same stage where he had built it. My phone rang at 8 o'clock that evening. The caller ID displayed an unknown cellular number. I pressed the answer button. Hello, Thomas. The voice belonged to my oldest son. The polite, trembling grief had vanished entirely from his tone. Stripped of its corporate mask, his voice sounded flat, sharp, and intensely dangerous. You really enjoy making things difficult, don't you, Dad? Luke asked, a cold chuckle escaping his lips. Dragging this through the local courts, hiring second-rate auditors to dig through old trash. Do you genuinely believe a few pieces of out-of-context paperwork are going to change what the community saw 5 years ago? You stole $1,460,000 from children who needed those scholarships, I answered, my voice steady, refusing to let him intimidate me in my own home. You framed your own sister, you manipulated your mother's memory, and you tried to steal my house. A heavy, suffocating silence hung over the line. When my son spoke again, the pleasant facade was gone forever. I built this organization into what it is today, Luke hissed, the venom bleeding openly into the phone speaker. You were ready to let it rot out of pure sentimentality. I did what was necessary to keep the doors open. And tomorrow night, at the Jubilee, the entire community is going to watch you step down, watch your daughter confess her guilt, and watch me save this family from your failing mind. He did not wait for a response. The call disconnected with a sharp click. Before answering, I had activated the recorder my lawyer instructed me to use whenever Luke contacted me directly. The call saved automatically as an untouched audio file. As soon as the line went dead, I forwarded the original recording to counsel for preservation, adding another piece of evidence that Luke understood the scheme and intended to complete it. The following morning, the digital landscape shifted again. Luke sent a final, revised version of the family reconciliation agreement directly to Hannah's email address. It was an updated version of the hallowed hush money package we had analyzed days earlier. The document was no longer disguised behind vague corporate terminology. Cornered by the court stay and the ticking clock of the independent audit, my son dropped all pretense. The revised Schedule B explicitly defined the payout as 50% of the net proceeds generated by the Harrington House liquidity event. The text stated that the funds would be fully released immediately after the conclusion of the Founders' Jubilee Gala, provided Hannah signed a sworn affidavit, affirming my mental incapacity, delivered a scripted public apology, and surrendered all legacy accounting files to the executive board. The digital contract was a textbook quid pro quo. It offered a massive financial reward in exchange for silence and the destruction of my legal standing. My daughter called me within 10 minutes of receiving the file. He sent the updated terms, Hannah said over the line, her voice remarkably calm. He thinks I am desperate enough to sign away our case for a share of the house money. What do you want to do? I asked. My lawyer and I drafted a response. The 35-year-old data analyst replied, a faint, razor-thin edge of satisfaction touching her tone. We are not rejecting him outright. We are going to play into his arrogance. Under strict legal guidance, Hannah did not accuse Luke of bribery. Instead, she adopted the persona of a pragmatic, cynical person, looking out for her own interests. She sent a series of carefully worded confirmation inquiries back to his private corporate email. She asked him to verify whether the reconciliation fund strictly represented her 50% share of the house sale proceeds. She asked if the payout was legally contingent upon signing the affidavit regarding my cognitive state and turning over Miriam's original accounting exports. She even pretended to worry that Naomi might steal the credit for the corporate restructuring, subtly prodding my son's immense ego. Luke fell directly into the trap. Driven by his desperate need to lock down compliance before the gala, he replied within the hour. His email response was a masterpiece of corporate arrogance. He wrote directly to his sister, spelling out the entire transaction in brutal clarity. The fund is your half of the house proceeds, Luke's email stated in black and white. It is released when the mutual documents are complete and the old records are returned. Stop overthinking it. I am giving you a way to correct the past without destroying what I built. He still did not type out the words I stole the money, but he did not have to. He had explicitly linked the cash from the house sale to the suppression of evidence and the fabrication of false affidavits. Under her lawyer's supervision, a forensic specialist exported the entire email thread, preserved the original headers and attachments, generated verification hashes for the forensic copies, and delivered the package to the lead financial crimes investigator. The trap was completely sealed. Every escape route had been cut off. The morning of the Founders' Jubilee arrived with a heavy, gray, overcast sky that threatened rain over Cedar Grove. The community center parking lot was already jammed with luxury sedans, local business owners, and major charity donors dressed in formal evening wear. I stood in the staging room behind the main auditorium, adjusting my silk tie in front of a tall mirror. My hands were entirely steady. Hannah stood near the doorway, wearing a tailored black dress that reflected none of the warmth of the spring season. She held the worn, leather-bound family Bible in her left hand, her fingers resting gently against the frayed blue ribbon marking her mother's final warning. The stage manager opened the heavy side door, signaling that the program was about to begin. Luke walked past us from the executive holding area. He wore a pristine charcoal tuxedo, his hair immaculately combed, projecting the exact image of a philanthropic savior stepping forward to guide his broken family through the dark. He paused for a fraction of a second, looking at his sister and his father standing in the dim backstage shadows. "Don't forget your lines," Luke whispered, a cold, victorious smile touching the corners of his mouth. "The community is waiting." The heavy wooden doors of the community center auditorium swung open, revealing rows of folding chairs packed tightly with local business owners, charity donors, and prominent town officials. Warm stage lights beat down on the varnished oak floorboards, casting long, wavering shadows across the back wall. The scent of fresh coffee, expensive perfume, and floor wax filled the air. Standing backstage in the damp chill of the wings, I felt the familiar weight of the wooden podium 50 feet ahead. 5 years ago, I had stood on that exact spot while my daughter was publicly humiliated. Tonight, the stage would witness a very different reckoning. Hannah stood silently beside me in the shadows, holding Miriam's worn leather Bible against her ribs. The blue bookmark ribbon hung down like a thread of frayed rope. She did not look at the crowd, her gaze fixed entirely on the heavy crimson curtain separating us from the audience. Applause rolled through the room like a distant wave of thunder. Luke stepped out from the opposite wing, adjusting his charcoal tuxedo jacket with practiced grace. My oldest son flashed a brilliant, humble smile to the crowd, radiating the exact blend of sorrow and strength that had fooled our community for a decade. He walked to the center of the stage, rested both hands on the polished wooden podium, and waited for the room to quiet down. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Luke began, his voice projecting smoothly through the overhead sound system, carrying that rich, resonant cadence designed to extract donations. "As many of you know, our family has walked through a season of profound testing. We have lost my precious mother, and we have weathered painful storms that threatened the very foundation of our charitable mission." In the wings, I watched the rhythmic movement of his shoulders. The man commanded the room with total confidence, entirely unaware that the digital net had already closed around him. "Tonight, we turn the page," Luke continued, his voice dropping an octave into a register of deep, manufactured humility. "My father, whose lifetime of service built this organization, has reached a point where he must step back from his leadership duties. Age and grief have taken their toll, requiring us to implement continuity planning to protect the children who rely on our scholarships." A sympathetic murmur rippled through the front rows. Several board members nodded in solemn agreement. "Before we look to the future, however, we must heal the wounds of the past," Luke said, gesturing toward the stage entrance with an open palm. "Please, welcome back my sister, Hannah, who is here tonight to address the mistakes of 5 years ago and help us close that dark chapter forever." The applause stuttered, growing hesitant and cold as the crowd turned their heads toward the wings. I did not wait for my son to introduce me. I stepped past the heavy crimson curtain first, walking straight into the blinding glare of the spotlights. Hannah followed close behind, holding the heavy family Bible like a shield. A sharp intake of breath swept through the auditorium. The local donors exchanged bewildered glances, clearly expecting a quiet, private family dispute rather than a public return. Luke stood frozen at the podium, his smile faltering for a fraction of a second before the executive discipline slammed back into place. He stepped aside, gesturing for us to approach the microphones with a welcoming sweep of his arm. "Dad," Luke murmured smoothly as I reached the center of the stage. "Take your time. Let us handle the announcements." I ignored him. I placed my hands on the cold brass stem of the microphone and looked out at the sea of familiar faces. Every eye in Cedar Grove was locked onto my face. 5 years ago, I stood on this exact stage. I began, my voice echoing off the high ceiling. I looked at the people sitting in these chairs, and I told you that my daughter had stolen $340,000 from the scholarship fund. The auditorium grew instantly, suffocatingly quiet. You could hear the low, mechanical hum of the overhead air conditioning vents. I presented you with logs, emails, and server printouts, I continued, turning my head to look directly at my oldest son. I stood right here and read a statement demanding her resignation. I chose to believe the calm presentation of my son over the frantic pleas of an innocent child. Luke stepped closer, his face draining of color. Dad, you are confused. This is not the time or the place for these personal grievances. Quiet, Luke, I said. The words cracked through the quiet room like a whip. I reached down and opened the heavy leather Bible, resting on the stand between us. The frayed blue ribbon parted the ancient pages. Hannah Harrington did not steal from this family, I declared, my voice ringing out with absolute finality. This family stole 5 years from her. An audible gasp rose from the middle rows. Several board members pushed themselves half out of their folding chairs, their expressions contorted in sudden shock. Luke lunged forward, grabbing the edge of the podium. His practiced sorrow vanished, replaced by a flash of raw, unfiltered panic. This is a malicious smear. My father is suffering from documented cognitive decline. He does not know what he is saying. He knows exactly what he is saying. A clear, steady voice interrupted from the stage entrance. Naomi walked out from behind the wings. She had shed her designer trench coat, wearing a simple black dress, her face pale and drawn. She did not look like a proud corporate director anymore. She looked like a woman who had finally decided to stop running. The medical evaluations were fabricated, Naomi announced to the stunned crowd, her voice carrying clearly without a microphone. Luke forged the timeline, and he prepared a contingency plan to pin the entire embezzlement on me the moment the auditors started asking questions. The auditorium erupted into chaotic noise. Shouts of disbelief crossed the room, and several donors stood up to get a better view of the stage. Luke spun around to face his wife, his eyes wide with fury. "Shut your mouth, Naomi. You are insane. I am the one who drafted the initial press release 5 years ago before the money was even reported missing." Naomi fired back, walking right up to the edge of the podium. "I helped him frame Hannah because he told me the foundation would collapse if anyone found out about his shell companies." The foundation's official live stream was still running. The technical director reached toward the mute controls, but the board's outside counsel, stationed in the booth under an evidence preservation notice, stopped him from altering or terminating a broadcast that now contained potential evidence. The platform continued recording, while an independent camera operated by our legal team preserved a second, time-stamped copy of everything happening on stage. Hannah stepped up to the second microphone. She did not raise her voice. She simply pressed play on the smartphone resting on her palm. The harsh sound of static hissed through the massive overhead speakers. A second later, Miriam's weak, labored voice filled the auditorium. "Why did the consulting firm receive a payment without a signed contract?" My dead wife's voice asked clearly through the sound system. The audio file played the entire exchange, capturing Luke's calm assurance about Hannah's login credentials, followed by his fatal admission. "Her login is still clean. I can reset it tonight." The recording clicked shut. The silence that followed was absolute. No one breathed. No one whispered. Every person in the room stared at the man standing behind the polished wooden podium. Luke's chest heaved. The polished executive mask was gone, burned away by the harsh spotlight. He looked around the auditorium, realizing that every single exit was blocked by the reality of what he had built. "You chose her over me," Luke whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of hatred and utter disbelief as he locked his gaze onto mine. I stepped away from the microphone, standing tall on the wooden floorboards, looking my son directly in the eye. "No," I answered, my voice steady and unyielding. 5 years ago, I chose you over the truth. I will not make that mistake twice." Luke slammed both fists down onto the wooden podium, his face twisting into an ugly snarl. "I built this organization. I kept the doors open while you were busy, living in the past. Everything I did was to save this family from a bunch of ungrateful children." The confession hung in the air, echoing off the high rafters, captured live by a dozen open microphones and recorded by the streaming servers. The heavy glass front doors of the community center pushed open with a sharp crash. 2 local police officers in formal uniforms walked down the center aisle, accompanied by a state investigator holding a thick, bound folder of certified warrants. The officers bypassed the paralyzed crowd, stepping calmly onto the raised stage. They did not rush, and they did not draw their weapons. They simply walked up to my son, stopping on either side of him. "Mr. Luke Harrington," the lead investigator said, his voice carrying clearly across the auditorium speakers as he displayed the official documents. "You are being detained for questioning regarding corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and the falsification of legal documents." Luke did not fight them. He did not yell or plead for mercy. He allowed the officers to take his arms, his posture collapsing as they turned him toward the rear exit. As they led him past the front row of folding chairs, he did not look at the stunned board members or the whispering donors. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor, disappearing through the heavy doors into the humid Georgia night. The auditorium remained frozen in a collective state of shock. I turned back toward the center of the stage. My legs felt suddenly heavy, the adrenaline draining from my body, leaving behind the profound fatigue of an old man who had finally stopped lying to himself. I looked for my daughter. Hannah had already stepped down from the wooden stage. She did not wait for me to approach her, and she did not ask for an emotional reconciliation. She walked down the center aisle toward the heavy glass exit doors, moving with that same calm, deliberate precision that had defined her survival over the past 5 years. On the wooden folding chair where she had been sitting in the wings, she had left a single item behind: the frayed, faded blue ribbon from Miriam's family Bible. The front door clicked shut behind me, the sound echoing hollowly through the high-ceilinged foyer of Harrington House. I stood alone in the dim entryway. The real estate broker had removed the physical advertising signs from the front lawn hours ago, yet the interior still felt invaded, smelling faintly of industrial air freshener and corporate staging. The furniture had been rearranged, leaving strange, clean rectangles on the hardwood floors where heavy antique dressers usually sat. I walked into the dark library. The glass display cabinet stood wide open, its wooden shelves entirely bare. Miriam's heavy leather Bible rested quietly in the center of the mahogany table, left behind like an abandoned artifact from a forgotten war. I dropped my car keys onto the desk, the sharp metallic clatter breaking the oppressive silence. I pulled out my phone, opened the messaging application, and stared at the empty chat window. I typed a single sentence to my daughter. "You were right. I should have listened." I hit send without rereading the words. I did not ask for a reply, and I did not expect one. Restitution could not be accomplished with a text message. Over the next several weeks, the chaotic aftermath of the Founders' Jubilee dismantled what was left of our family's public facade. The board of directors held an emergency vote at dawn following the gala. The members who had intentionally conspired to cover up the embezzlement were forced to resign under threat of immediate criminal exposure, while the remaining directors issued a comprehensive, public statement retracting every false claim published against Hannah over the past 5 years. The organization sent formal letters of apology to every academic institution and corporate partner that had rejected her job applications during her exile, effectively clearing her professional name across the entire region. The scholarship fund itself was placed under the temporary supervision of an independent, court-appointed management trustee to ensure that the children relying on our educational grants were never again penalized for the crimes of a corrupt executive. Naomi faced the cold reality of her choices without the protective shield of her husband's wealth. She filed for an uncontested divorce immediately after the arrest, cooperating fully with federal investigators by handing over every remaining digital archive and communication record in her possession. She voluntarily returned the luxury assets, vehicles, and designer jewelry purchased with funds siphoned from the charity reserve. The federal prosecutors acknowledged her cooperation by recommending a reduced sentencing guideline, but her reputation within elite social circles was permanently shattered. She moved out of Cedar Grove quietly, retreating to a small apartment across the state line, leaving behind the glossy image she had spent a decade constructing. Luke discovered that loyalty purchased with stolen money vanished the moment the accounts were frozen. His high-priced corporate defense attorneys withdrew from the case within days when the retainer funds were identified as proceeds of wire fraud and subjected to government seizure. Faced with an overwhelming mountain of certified bank records, door logs, password reset trails, and his own incriminating emails spelling out the quid pro quo of the property transaction, my oldest son ultimately accepted a plea agreement on multiple counts of grand larceny, corporate embezzlement, and the falsification of legal documents. The federal judge handed down a substantial prison sentence, coupled with mandatory financial restitution and a permanent lifetime ban prohibiting him from managing any charitable organization, trust, or third-party estate. In his final, bitter letter sent from the county holding facility before his transfer to a federal correctional institution, Luke wrote that I had chosen to destroy my own flesh and blood over the family legacy. I folded the paper, placed it in the desk drawer, and did not reply. I answered his accusation with a simple, quiet truth. The family legacy was already destroyed the moment we traded honesty for a comfortable lie. The legal status of Harrington House required careful, deliberate restructuring. I refused to let the property remain a symbol of control, and I refused to hand it over to Hannah as a guilt-ridden peace offering. Instead, my attorney restructured the deed into an independent community trust. A significant portion of the home's future equity was permanently dedicated to funding educational scholarships for underprivileged students in the county, ensuring that the walls where I raised my children finally served the exact purpose the foundation originally promised. The house was no longer a weapon or a prize. It was simply bricks and mortar, stripped of its power to manipulate. 3 weeks after the final court filings were processed, my phone buzzed against the wooden kitchen counter. An unfamiliar number appeared on the screen, accompanied by a brief, plain text message. Coffee. Public place. 1 hour. I did not hesitate. I drove 30 minutes outside of town to the modest roadside diner where we had met months before. The afternoon sun beat down against the cracked pavement, and the neon sign above the entrance hummed with a low, familiar vibration. I arrived early, selecting a booth near the front window where the light cut sharply across the worn laminate table. Hannah walked through the glass door at exactly 2 o'clock. She wore a simple navy blue sweater, her hair unfastened, falling naturally around her shoulders. She did not scan the room nervously or choose a table with a strategic exit strategy. She walked straight to my booth, pulled out the opposite seat, and slid the worn, leather-bound Bible across the table between us. Resting neatly on top of the ancient cover was the frayed, faded blue ribbon she had picked up from the folding chair in the backstage wings. We sat in silence for a long time, listening to the muffled clatter of ceramic mugs and silverware from behind the service counter. "I have not forgiven you," my daughter said quietly, her voice level and devoid of theatrical anger. "And I honestly do not know if I will ever call you Dad the way I used to." I did not look away, and I did not offer a practiced, comforting platitude. "I understand. What did Mom try to tell you in those final months?" Hannah asked, her gaze falling softly onto the leather cover of her mother's book. "Before she died, what was she trying to make you see?" I took a deep, steady breath. The defensive walls I had built around my pride over 68 years finally crumbled into dust. "First," I said, reaching across the table to gently touch the edge of the Bible, "I need to tell you every single thing I refuse to see. Look at your own life for a moment, and ask yourself what price you are willing to pay for a flawless public image. We spend decades polishing our reputations, building walls of prestige, and protecting comfortable illusions because admitting a mistake feels too heavy to bear. We convince ourselves that looking right matters more than doing right, and that loyalty belongs to the person who makes us feel secure rather than the person who tells us the uncomfortable truth. But a life built on polished deception will always demand a brutal toll. When you trade honesty for convenience, you do not just protect an image. You hand over the keys of your life to anyone ruthless enough to manage it for you. The hardest lesson of this journey is that true integrity begins the moment you stop defending your own pride. It requires the courage to look at the people you have wronged, strip away your excuses, and listen without interrupting. Accountability is not about regretting getting caught. It is about owning the blind spots you chose to ignore because the truth was too inconvenient to look at. If you spend your life choosing the child, the partner, or the circumstance that flatters your ego instead of the one that honors reality, you will eventually find yourself standing alone in an empty house, surrounded by symbols of a success that has lost its soul. Repairing a shattered trust cannot be rushed with a quick apology or a convenient transaction. Forgiveness is never a debt that someone owes you just because you finally decided to see the light. When you break a relationship with your own arrogance, earning back even a fraction of that trust takes years of quiet consistency, unmasked listening, and absolute patience. You have to accept that the people you hurt are under no obligation to heal on your timeline, and that the only true amends is becoming someone who refuses to look away from reality ever again. Think about the relationships in your own world right now. Where are you currently choosing the comfortable lie over the painful truth because it is easier to keep up appearances than to face a difficult reality? What would happen if you stopped protecting your pride today and finally listened to the person you have been silencing?